And when you get all of your news and information free, you've got to start asking yourself, what is the incentive for someone to provide this information to me? If somebody's providing you information for free, they're doing it for a reason.
Welcome to the next episode of Barenaked Money. Colin and Josh here as usual, pulling back the shower curtain on whatever the topic of the day is. And today we're joined by somebody who knows exactly how things work in the media world and why that should matter to individual consumers of media. And this is, again, something that we talk a lot about on our podcast. Nicholas White is joining us today. He's the CEO of Fragment Media, and they're the company behind titles like The Daily Dot and Nautilus. And he spent his entire career working in this media machine, and he's building something new now. And that's something that, again, if you know us, something that we like to hear about and something that we like to sort of push back on the industry norms. So he'll fit right into that mold. So we're going to talk about the traditional media incentives, how traditional media works today, sensationalism, and how that drives a lot of viewership and consumer behavior, and how he's trying to build something better. So, Nicholas, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
I think it's important off the top that the disclaimer, like we're not related. We have the same last name, but there's no relation here, even though we're both bearded. That's completely a coincidence. So I want to make sure that our listeners understand that right up front.
I mean, aren't we
Thanks.
all related at some level, somewhere back in the whatever?
Wow, we're getting deep early. I don't know where to go from here.
Nick, what I was hoping you could start with is just giving us a bit of a lay of the land and maybe a look behind the curtain, to use the metaphor that I used earlier, on the media world. What's the incentives that are driving media these days? What is your specific issue or pushback on it, and how are you trying to do things a little bit different?
Thank you for asking the question. On some level, my thesis, really for my entire career, has been that the business model behind media is broken. And that the business model itself is really what creates sort of perverse incentives for the media, news media in particular, to sort of work in ways that are not, I think, what any of us would choose if we were designing a system from scratch. And so my personal mission in life has been to find a better business model for news media and for journalism that would be better both for the journalism itself and for society, which is, ultimately what journalism is intended to serve. So if I would zoom out and sort of give you kind of the grand sweep of history, macro view of where I think we've been and where I think we're going, is from the invention of essentially the penny press in the 1830s all the way to the invention of the internet, you had in the mass news media a business model that relied a majority on advertising, and a minority, but a significant minority, on reader revenue. The thing that happened when the internet came along is it became accepted conventional wisdom, and was probably true at some point, that people, consumers, readers would not pay for news media on the internet. And as a result, you ended up with 95% of the revenue, give or take, coming directly from advertisers and almost none of it coming from readers. The result of that is that the perverse incentives of the previous period were just put on steroids. They got so much worse because all of the revenue was coming from advertisers. And as I think it was Larry Page said, if you're not paying for the product, then you are the product, right? And so a lot of what we see in the media, you mentioned sensationalism, is really about the goal for media since the internet became prevalent is almost exclusively to distract you, right? Like a sensationalist headline is not about informing you or making you a more enlightened citizen, or even telling you something you just really want to know. It's about distracting you. It's about getting you to click long enough to show you a few ad impressions. I think that there's a structural shift that is occurring now, which is that the major platforms are forcing a shift so that media in the future will have to be primarily driven by reader revenue. And it's one, that the platforms are shifting it, forcing the shift, and two, that consumer attitudes have changed. People have sort of become aware of the fact that you get what you pay for, and that includes in news media. And so the attitude, the willingness of people to pay has really changed. So as a result, I think we're seeing a structural shift to reader revenue that presents both interesting business opportunities, which is what we're trying to capitalize on as a company, but also creates, I think, hopefully a much better situation in the future for journalism and for society.
Maybe you could comment on the idea, because there's many of us having been around when the internet was kind of coming into vogue and being invented, that it was like, oh my goodness, everybody gets a voice. So that we're going to see this huge mushroom and this plethora of points of view and public discourse, and it's going to be so wonderful because there's no barrier now to people communicating with each other and saying what's on their mind. And there was going to be this democratization of the voices. That was back in the idealistic days, but the media power has kind of been concentrated with a few major ownership groups controlling some of the major pipelines. Like, it almost seems to have gone the opposite direction of maybe the idyllic ideas at the outset of the internet. Does that play into the narrative that you're kind of describing?
Absolutely. I think it's at the core of that narrative. I remember the information superhighway, right? The idea that we were all going to in the global village, right? These were sort of the buzzwords of the 90s when the internet was first being created and starting to reach sort of the first wave of customers, users. And it felt utopian. It felt magical in a lot of ways. And something I say all the time is, remember when the internet used to be fun? And it was. You have to go way back, right? But there was a time when the internet was really fun. Um, and there were horrible things about it too. There's always been trolls and stuff like that. But there was a time when it was fun. And I think what happened is advertising in a lot of ways. And you can't have fun for free at a certain point, right? There's no free lunch. And so that meant a couple of things. Um, One, it meant that the algorithms are designed that run the internet, right? So you started with sort of everybody just wrote a blog or something like that. Everybody could have a website. You could have your type form or whatever it was. And there was sort of this multiplicity of voices. But then the platforms started to get more and more of the concentration of users. And in order to keep you there and keep you engaged, right, the platforms designed algorithms that are about that. They're about engagement. They're about saying, what's going to maximize my time on site, right? And that creates this incentive toward distraction. I think of it as, if what I'm trying to do is get you to stop in the feed for an extra couple minutes, well, it's the same thing as getting you to pay attention to a car wreck on the side of the road as you're driving down the highway, right? And so there is this push toward distraction. And then on top of it, first of all, that's its own kind of specialized skill. And then all the algorithms work on a kind of batting average principle. So you build momentum over time. And what it does is it concentrates attention via the algorithm on those couple of users or companies or publishers or what have you, those accounts that are best at driving that kind of distraction. And capturing that attention and not letting it go. And so it also then gets amplified by this kind of winner take all effect that is embedded in how the algorithms work.
You mentioned algorithms, and you also mentioned that you think people are going to be more willing to pay for news going forward, and there's a bit of a structural change. But aren't the 2 billion people that are doom scrolling on TikTok and Instagram every day the exact antithesis of what you're saying there? Aren't these people kind of arguing against you, that people are willing to pay for good news?
On some level, what the platforms have managed to do is sort of hack human psychology, right? Very basic human nature. We all stop and look at the crash on the side of the highway, right? Like, you can't not do that. Every ounce of our DNA, right? Like, makes us do that. We can't fight it. And at the same time, I think while that's true, 2 billion people are doom scrolling through TikTok, and I spend more time doom scrolling than I would like either to admit or to be doing, in fact. At the same time, the New York Times has more paying subscribers than it has ever had by an order of magnitude. The number of people who are paying directly for news is higher than it's ever been. The number of people who are paying for any kind of content is higher than it's ever been. That you now have people on, individuals on Patreon, on similar platforms that are able to build, sort of Kevin Kelly's 1,000 fans in a way that like was not nearly as possible 10, 15 years ago, right? So I think actually if you look at, I'm trying to remember these, I'm going to get the statistic not quite right, but there's, I believe if you look at YouTube, actually more time is spent with long form video than the shorts. There are these sort of countervailing tendencies. Look at the growth of Substack, right? Like there, as much as, yes, there are these platforms like TikTok that, sort of tell the opposite story. I would actually argue that in a lot of ways, that's a lot of momentum from the old sort of model that is continuing. And in fact, actually, I would argue that platforms like Facebook and Google have reached the extraction phase, and they're just trying to make as much as they can, as long as they can, and they know it's actually declining. So they're just trying to get out as much of it as they can and prolong death as long as they can. But I think that they're really just riding on inertia and momentum, and that where the movement is happening now is in higher quality, longer form, paid for forms of content across the board.
Are you afraid they're going to notice and reverse course and come back after your lunch?
I think it's really hard to do that.
Oh, Dan, I agree.
Right? Like, the number, it's sort of like, why didn't Blockbuster buy Netflix? Um, right? Like, not that it never ever happens, but you can find a lot more examples of companies failing to do that. And it's because the simple reality is that that Netflix in whatever it was, 1999, 2001, when it was for sale, was not going to come close to replacing the revenue that Blockbuster was going to lose from selling Kit Kat bars at the checkout line, right? Like that's what their real business was, and there was no way they would do that. So like the thing is, the new model always is slower to replace the old model. And so I think it's going to be very, very difficult for existing players to sort of adapt to the new world, because it's just not going to be lucrative enough, fast enough for them to be able to sell essentially their shareholders on it. That being said, there are exceptions, right? And like the winners right now are the New York Times, the Atlantic, the New Yorker. These publications are actually healthier and than they have ever been, and they are growth businesses. And most people haven't sort of updated their priors yet to realize that these companies are actually doing incredibly well. And it's not because they noticed that this change was happening and took advantage of it. It's because, for historical reasons, they were already set up well for it, and the world that they were trying and failing to adapt to sort of changed back in their direction. And so like I think it's possible. They have all the money in the world. That in theory they could, right? But they almost never do.
It failed long enough they became successful. Now there's a business, like there's a book. You could write a book on that. I think people would read that.
Yeah, that's basically what you're saying about the traditional publications is they totally missed the boat for a long enough period of time that now they're leading again by having a subscription business. And that I was kind of interested to hear your thoughts on, did these traditional publications, the newspapers, if you want to call it that, did they really make a mistake by not charging for their services early? But it sounds like you very clearly think that they should have been doing that from the start.
There's I've heard a lot of people in this business say that the huge mistake was the New York Times deciding to put all of its content for free on the internet in 1996, 97, 98, whatever year that was. And I don't know. I think there was a culture of everything being free on the internet at that time. You were talking about like a really very small number of people using it at that time. And actually, I think as much as I can rag on the New York Times as anyone else, I mean, it's a hobby in this country, and it's very much a favorite pastime in the industry. At the same time, like I really admire the degree to which, when they did recognize that this was the model they were going to have, they've worked at it very methodically over the last decade. And whereas now it's an incredibly strong company that's in growth mode, you've heard this thing in startups. There's a lot of versions of it, right? But it basically comes down to whoever does the most experiments in the end will win. And the New York Times has done that, right? The New York Times has been experimenting with how to get people to pay for news for at least 10 years. And so like it's not by accident, right? Like they may have made a fateful decision. I don't really know for sure if in the age of the information superhighway and the global village that we've been talking about, if they really could have been successful at that time. I know a lot of people feel like they set the industry back a decade, but at the same time, I think you have to give them credit for the fact that like they've also led the way into the new model.
I think we reached out and we're excited to have this conversation as we see ourselves a little bit of the same way in our industry. And one of the comments I'm on record as making many, many times that I'd like to be a nice restaurant on a street full of nice restaurants. So I'm always like looking up and down the street to see who else is following and a bit of a proof of concept. And if we are right, then the street should get pretty crowded and we should have lots of people. Are you either, can you give, I don't know if you want to give examples or whether do you see other people thinking like you and getting traction in this kind of business model? Or is it just some of the incumbents are having resurgences and, kind of going back to the old days? Like, do you see a combination of that? What's your view?
Absolutely. I mean, I think, the upstarts that are working really well right now are all moving toward the Ruta model, right? Whether that's Substack as a platform is moving in this direction, has been one of the leaders in moving in this direction, but also their publications, right? The most famous of which is Free Press, Barry Weiss's Substack. But you've got Puck in a little bit of a hybrid way. They're more focused on sponsored revenue, but Semaphore would be sort of on that list. Tangle actually is a newsletter with a really really good subscription model, paid subscription model. I think you absolutely are seeing the newest players in the space that are doing well are doing it with a reader revenue model. It's just they're just subscale at this point as compared to a New York Times or something like that, right? We're early enough in the cycle where the really big numbers are actually being put up by incumbents. And I think that there is a tension, to use your sort of restaurant example, right? Like it's hard to roll up on Restaurant Row where everybody else has got a Michelin star with a food truck. And
Yep.
one of the things that we sort of talk about internally is the big shift that needs to be made is you need content worth paying for, right? Like, and it is in fact, it's actually very cheap to write, headlines that get people to click. We've all clicked on clickbait, the headline that's sensationalistic that your couch may be killing you. Oh, I don't know about that, right? And you click in, and it's basically a content-free piece of content, right? There's no there. That is very free to mass, very very cheap to mass produce. Nobody's going to pay for it. If you want to produce a subscription product that is worth paying for, you have to invest in it to a certain extent, right? You have to have a certain level of quality, and so it's harder. I think the cycle is maybe moving faster than comparable cycles because you have to either have an investment in editorial, in technology and tools that allows you to create something worth paying for, or you have to have a unique perspective. Even something like Tangle, right, where it's in a lot of ways one guy's perspective. I mean, he has a team and everything, but this is not like somebody who wakes up in the morning and churns out 25 clickbait headlines before breakfast and moves on with their life, right? Like he's doing research and working on something, putting a lot of time and effort into each and every piece. And so like I think that there's a high bar, there's a higher bar to entry. That sort of means moving forward is going to be more difficult, and the investment community isn't necessarily on board with this idea yet. And as a result, like if you want to pile up a lot of capital to build the next New York Times, well, I don't know which VC is writing that check right now. Never mind the fact that VCs are disrupted themselves.
Well, not to monopolize, but you kind of led into my next line of questioning. What's the business model for securing the independence that you're looking for? Because there's one thing to have an ideal, but there's a second thing to be able to afford the ideal. And how have you done it? And maybe more broadly, how should players be approaching this to be able to earn the right to take a longer view, to earn the right to have a longer payoff? Like, what's the path there? What path are you guys on, or what path is available?
It comes down to a couple of different things, and we kind of, I'd say there's two or three strategies that we're employing to sort of pursue that direction. And I hope you don't mind if my cat joins the podcast.
I love cats.
She loves to be pet and does not take no for an answer. So I can put her down, but she'll just be back here. So I might as well do it. So I think in terms of getting the investment and maintaining our ideals, I go back to, again, it's the business model. First and foremost, investors of all types want some kind of return. And so if you build your house on reader revenue, if you say that's how we're going to make money, and you can prove that that is a good business model, then it becomes very natural to say, and we're going to continue serving readers. We're going to give them something worth paying for. The way we think about it internally is our primary asset is if the asset of an advertising based company is eyeballs, i.e. distraction, our asset is trust. And so I can say to an investor, Mr. Investor, like, you're going to get a much better return over time if I maintain the trust and loyalty of our readers, who are the ones who are paying us directly. So first and foremost, the fact that our economic incentives are aligned with our journalistic incentives in the reader revenue model gives us that level of stability. We've taken it a step further in two ways. One, we're a public benefit company. And the reason we're a public benefit company is because that allows us to say, this is our mission, and we're going to hold ourselves, our management, and our board of directors accountable to it, as well as to our bottom line. And the reason we're doing that really is as a sort of filtering function for our investors, right? Like, our investors are going to see that up front, and if they're not on board with that, if that's not something that they think is actually going to be part of how they get their return, then they're not going to invest. And so part of it is to sort of help us find the right investors for our approach. But the last piece is right now we're about to launch a community equity crowdfunding round, and sort of our philosophy is like, if you want to serve your readers, then make your readers your customer and also make them your owner. And so, like, we hope to be reader owned as well as reader supported on a business model level.
Yeah, so I was just going to ask, can you explain more about what a public benefit company actually is? Because it's not a term I'm too familiar with.
So it's essentially it's a legal designation. We're organized in Delaware as a public benefit company, and what it allows you to do is put your and I'm not a lawyer. I just play one on television, so I'm going to give you my understanding of what this does. But please consult your own counsel. That being said, my understanding of what it's allowed us to do is we have put our mission in our charter, and what it means is that legally our fiduciary responsibility is now judged both in terms of, as you probably know, so historically, the board of directors, the management of a company, its fiduciary responsibility is typically measured in terms of dollars and cents, right? Like, did you make the most money for your shareholders? And that is how you're judged to have done or not done your fiduciary responsibility. Well, once you become a public benefit company and you've registered that mission as part of your charter, now your fiduciary responsibility is measured both it puts your mission on equal footing with your profits, and says, okay, like, you did your fiduciary responsibility if you both maximized profit and fulfilled your mission.
It's definitely an interesting model, and we'll see if it becomes more common, because it doesn't seem like something that's common to me. But in our industry, when we end up in these situations where maybe the end consumer is not best served, the finance industry, the investment industry tends to regulate. Is there a regulatory solution to some of the issues that you think exist in mainstream media?
There's sort of a historical answer, and there's a logical answer. And I think from a logical standpoint, it's really hard to imagine a set of regulations that does not run afoul of the right to freedom of speech, right? Like I struggle to see how you write something. Now you get things like the fairness doctrine, and this is where we're going to shift to the historical version, right? And the fairness doctrine was probably the most successful version of this. And that at least it said, well, you had to represent sort of both sides of the argument. It was really only permissible from a legalistic standpoint, as I understand it, because you were giving it only applied to broadcasters. And it applied to broadcasters because you were essentially giving them a public good, right? You were giving them a right to the airwaves. And so therefore you could get around the government. The government on some level doesn't really have a right to regulate what people say, but because you're giving people a public good, you can at least put that kind of guardrail around it. It doesn't, and you're not telling them what to say, you're just saying you can say it sort of both ways. Now, I would also argue that if you look back at some other regulations, cross-media ownership, for example, was regulated in the late 60s and 70s, I think. And I would actually argue that was negative on the part of free speech. And you would think it wouldn't be, because what you're essentially saying is, one person can't own all the media in a geographical location. If you own the newspaper, you can't own the TV station. That sounds good enough, except that at the same time, you can't copyright news. You can't copyright information, right? The Congress passed Bill XYZ today is not something that's copyrightable. And so in some sense, what you're doing is you're saying that everybody else can copy everybody else's work. The reason we have copyright laws is so that the people who generate the IP, have the ability to get a return from the effort of generating that IP, which makes it worth the investment to do so. Well, when you sort of say everybody in the world can copy your IP without any kind of restriction, and that's a free speech law, like what you're doing is you're making it impossible to invest in that IP. And so it has these perverse, it can really backfire, is my point, right? So I think regulation becomes really, really difficult in this sort of scenario, in this venue.
Yeah, because stories don't always have two sides. Sometimes they've got one, sometimes they have five, sometimes there's six. So the oversimplification and trying to bring legislation to that seems a little bit fruitless. But let me throw another one at you, because we had a great podcast guest here not that long ago, Matthew Facciani, who talked about spread of misinformation, and he did studies on how misinformation spreads, and that does seem to be one of the more dominant tidal waves, is kind of sweeping the interweb, and people are consuming what they want, or what they think they want, or confirmation bias and all the rest of it. So there's almost a rush to lower quality information in some regards. And that seems to run contrary to the trend you're hoping to ride in providing good quality information and paying for it. Because I don't think that your business model involves pandering to the flat earthers. I don't think you're going to have a subscription service, printing things and I'm calling out the flat earthers, and they can come after me if they need to. But I don't think that that's part of your model, right?
Not part of ours. That being said, we're not starting a flat Earth publication anytime soon. But that doesn't mean that the structural change I'm arguing, I actually think the structural change that we're talking about toward reader revenue may actually benefit the Flat Earth Society and some of the disinformation. I don't think we're going to start a Flat Earth publication, but somebody will. And they will probably be able to find enough people to subscribe and to support that publication.
Your thesis is agnostic to the actual veracity of the information. Your business model could work for good and for evil.
I think business models and economics in general, right, are a tool set that we can try to use for good and ill.
Yep.
And they don't have in them, like a hammer or a screwdriver, they're not necessarily beneficial or malevolent. But I think so we're trying to use this particular hammer and screwdriver for what we view to be good things. And I think that everything has a shadow side, right? And so if you're in the reader revenue business, I think you're going to get the largest possible audience offering really reliable information. You're going to get the largest possible audience offering truth. That doesn't mean that there isn't still going to be some small group of people who has their own truth that they want to find, see, and support. And so I think, to go back to your example, I think the Round Earth magazine will be a bigger magazine and will be a better business in the end. But that doesn't mean that Flat Earth magazine won't also exist and won't also potentially do well.
I want to live in the world you're describing, just for the record, Nick. But I appreciate your ambidextrous way of describing the business model.
I mean, I think it was Peter Drucker who said the best way to predict the future is to create it.
Ooh, there
So
we
the best
go.
you can do is try, right?
We're now going firmly into the Bond supervillain category.
You're talking about a future where we're looking for a reader revenue generated driven model. Is it something that is going to happen naturally in your mind, or is there something we need to do as consumers or society to accelerate this push?
I think the single biggest thing is the willingness to pay for news, right? To sort of, for people to recognize that you do get what you pay for, that there is a cost to free. And when you get all of your news and information free, you got to start asking yourself, well, what is the incentive for someone to provide this information to me? What is the phrase? It's not from the altruism of the baker or candlestick maker that we rely on them for our supper, right? It's from their regard for their own self-interest, right? And so, like, if somebody's providing you information for free, they're doing it for a reason, right? And you got to ask yourself, what is that reason, right? And then I think on the flip side of that, it's to recognize that there are high quality publications out there. There are groups of people, there are journalists who really just want to find the truth and share it with you. And that effort is worth paying for. And nobody's, relatively few people are charging an arm and a leg for that service, right? They're charging the cost of a latte in order to give you something that's really reliable. And we are in a period where it's the Wild West. Anybody can start a publication. They might be a flat earther. They might be Galileo, finally speaking the actual truth. And so there is a sense right now of caveat emptor, right? Like it is on us to sort of determine who and what is a credible source and what isn't. But I think realizing that when you find a credible source, they are giving you value. They are giving you value worth paying for, is I think the thing that ultimately changes the world. That because the reality is I can complain about big business and the yahoos that run them and the perverse incentives. I can talk about regulatory capture. I can, I can complain with the best of them. But the reality is actually that on the whole, the market is incredibly responsive to consumer preferences. On the whole, there are, of course, exceptions, but on the whole, business gives people what they want. And so if people start to recognize that what they want is actually reliable, credible information and they're willing to pay for it, then whether we succeed or fail, I think you're going to see the market change, and you're going to see it change very, very quickly.
What is next for you? Are you looking to add more titles? Is that the path forward for your merry ship? Is that, are you looking to acquire other publications and put them onto your platform, or is it just an organic thing? I mean, what's next for you?
That is part of the goal, but that's not next. That's a little bit further down the path. What we're really focused on right now is really proving out our model, proving that you can start a reader revenue driven publication either from scratch or from very small, that you can make it not as a publication with a long history like the Atlantic or the New York Times, but that you can bring something that people want. You can serve an existing information need, that you can do it profitably, capital efficiently. We need to prove that you can do that. and that we can do it repeatably. And then once we've done that, then we'll be looking to, and I think we're close. I think within the next 12 months, it will have shown that we can do it. And once we have, then what we're going to be looking at is okay, how do we now rinse and repeat? How do we bring our model to more and more of the information needs sort of across the interest graph, if I can sound a little bit like a internet finance bro for just a second.
So you are going after the flat earthers. Okay. Fair enough.
Let's impose some really important powers on you, Nick. Let's say you have a magic wand, you can redesign the media industry from scratch. How would you structure it today so the truth wins going forward?
Great question. I don't exactly know how this comes to be, but and I think it'll have to evolve anyway, but it's what I hope for. I think what we'd want to see is that there's a layer of well-organized, accessible fact that is available to everyone and that is verifiable, so that it's very hard to get away with just, and it should be, right? Like with the internet, this was the promise of the information superhighway, right? We were supposed to be able to all see and know and look up quickly and easily that the sky is blue and that water is wet. And then you'd have, and there's plenty more to argue about, right? Like we can all have lots of if we all agree that the sky is blue, that water is wet, and the earth is round, then we can still have plenty of other arguments. And I'm not, as a journalist, I'm in no way, shape, or form trying to reduce or restrain those arguments. But I do think that there are certain things that we know to be true. And so I think the ideal scenario here is one where the internet somehow creates that layer of accessible, verified, and verifiable fact that makes it very difficult as a result to get away with saying that is something that is simply not true. And then we still have robust argument. We still have two sides of an issue or five sides of an issue, or as they say, you get 50 VC in a room, you'll get 75 opinions. Same can be true of journalists and if not even more so, right? I think you would have this layer that is a foundation then for all those different opinions and arguments. And we would still have a robust and passionate cultural conversation, but that it would be founded on that level of verifiable, accessible fact. And in some sense, like, isn't that the dream we're still chasing, right? Like, isn't that, that's what we hoped the internet would be. That's what we hoped a blockchain would be, right? Like, we keep reinventing this idea that there should be some unified field of truth that we'd all be able to stand on together and then worry about the rest of it, because there's still plenty to decide. We just haven't figured it out yet, but I hope that it's out there still.
We may have somebody that has as audacious a goal as we have for our industry. So that's a pretty impressive goal, and it would have to be an awfully big magic wand and overcome human nature, because we gave everybody the opportunity to do this and they chose not to. So I think there's a fundamental flaw in human nature, because I remember all the promises and you're bringing back all the memories of like, everything there is to know is going to be on my phone. Oh my God, this is amazing. I'll never be wrong about anything again. And then everybody got to have an opinion. And like, oh my goodness, here we go. And this is the room we find ourselves in.
It is, and yet I also like I want to be cynical. I'm super cynical, but since you've already staked out the cynical position in this argument, I feel now as a journalist the need to oppose everything you say. So I do want to bring out, like, I think there are glimmers. There are moments of success, right? Like Wikipedia is actually pretty good, right? Like, and that's really harking back. Because if you remember back when we were talking about the information superhighway and stuff like that too, right? The idea that Wikipedia, that a crowdsourced encyclopedia could be in any way, shape, or form useful or reliable, was very controversial. It was absurd. People didn't believe it. And today, like, there have been studies, it's well verified that Wikipedia is both more comprehensive and has fewer errors than Encyclopedia Britannica and similar, the World Book or whatever it was called. That so I do want to believe that there is a way to do it.
Like I was recently described by a journalist as being bleakly optimistic, which I think kind of describes a little bit of where we've ended up here.
Well, now you know what to put on your tombstone. That's
Yeah.
fantastic.
I'm hoping that somebody is hearing this and will think to do that, because I would proudly have that on my tombstone.
Yes, that's really good. Or the name of your autobiography.
Here we go. All these ideas. I hope somebody's writing them down.
Not only is it getting written down, it's getting recorded, Colin. So,
Oh, that's right. It's one of them fancy ones. I forgot.
any final thoughts or final questions, final remarks, Nick?
You said a minute ago that that sound remarkably similar to your thesis for how you'd like to your magic wand that you'd like to wave in your industry, and I'm curious. I hadn't come across that. I'm curious what your magic wand is. I'm sure your listeners are already very familiar with it, but
We always like talking about it. So the problem in the financial industry is that it's sales dominated. Success is, can you sell it? And
mm,
that's for lifestyle, that's for credit, that's for investments. It's not about being what's right for somebody. Richard Thaler was one of the fathers of behavioral finance. I heard him on a podcast say it's much easier to take advantage of people's weaknesses than it is to correct them. And the financial industry has really, really, really taken that and run with it. So I think in our ideal world, and Josh, you can correct me if I'm wrong or add more color, if we could eliminate the sales culture from the financial world and turn it into a service organization where it should be. There's different numbers out there, but if you take a look back in the early 1900s, the percentage of GDP that was the financial industry was, double digits, but it was low teens. Now, depending on numbers you're looking at and when you look at, that number is in the mid 20s, or 30% of the economy is now, their GDP is the financial. All we do is move money around. Like, we don't make a car, we don't operate on anybody, we don't deliver a newspaper or anything. All we do is move money around. Why is it costing so much to move all that money around? Because it can, and because it's a sales culture. And if people want to be stupid, let's help them be stupid. Let's help them be stupid, and let's be profitable at it. So I think, if Josh was to ask me that question, I would say if we could remove the sales from the financial industry and turn it into a service industry, that would be my magic wand. How to get from where we are to there, I don't know, because there's such an entrenched inertia there, and there's such a power base there, and they've lulled people into a sense of comfort. And so we're going to try to be the spark that ignites the flame. I don't know, Josh, did I do a good enough job of putting words around that?
Yeah, well, I'm sure, Nick, you can see a lot of the parallels between what Colin just described and the ad revenue led media as it is today, taking advantage of people's weaknesses, monetizing them rather than actually delivering the service or the information or the good financial advice. So I think that's certainly a good way to put it. I think sales isn't a bad thing, right? I think it gets a bad connotation because what it is, but sales can be a good thing as long as it's incentivized in the right way. So I think a big issue with the financial industry and the culture in general around it is the way that things are incentivized. So a big part of what we've done and what we're trying to do is build an organization, a framework, a platform that removes some of those conflicts or all of the conflicts if we can, and incentivizes the right type of behavior rather than the next sale.
it is really interesting, right? Because you certainly in the financial industry and in a lot of roles, you have an explicit fiduciary responsibility, and you think of yourself in many ways as a fiduciary. And I think as a journalist, everybody gets into being a journalist in order to serve readers, right? Like they want to inform the public. That is, they want to uncover the truth and inform the public. That's what you want to do, right? We all get into these things, not all of us, but most of us get into these things sort of with our heart in the right place. Um, we want to be of service, actually, to use your phrase. And I think the financial incentives, the imperatives take over. if you permit me, actually, I read this essay by Václav Havel years ago, and it was one of those things where you read it and you go, man, this guy's articulating everything I ever thought and couldn't articulate myself, right? It was so powerful. Um, and he was talking about how we all as humans are locked in a very inhuman system. He talked about walking home from school as a child and being able to see over the tops of the trees a smokestack belching black smoke into the atmosphere, right? And he was like, I know that's bad. I don't know how it's bad. I didn't know anything about this was long before, he wasn't talking about environmentalism really. This was really about the fall of communism and the Western system and so on, of capitalism. And he was like, I know this is inhuman. It's not good for people. It's not good for the forest. It's not good for the farmers. It's not good for the ecosystem. Anyway, so he was criticizing this kind of system. And he tells this story about he was going to then talk about this. And he's been invited now. He's been released from prison. It's after the fall of the Berlin Wall, all that stuff. Now he's being celebrated across the world, and he's invited to speak at something, Davos type of situation, right? And he stands up in front of this group of people, and they are all presidents and prime ministers and CEOs of Fortune 500 companies around the world. I mean, these are the people who've created the system, right, that he's going to criticize, and he's not going to hold anything back. And he's thinking to himself, they're either going to applaud politely and walk away and forget everything I've just said, or I'm going to be arrested. One of the two. And he finishes this talk, and there's this pause. And then the entire room rises to its feet in standing ovation. And he does not know what to make of it. He's just like, how is this happening? I think I know what's happening. And I think it's that all those people who have all the power in the world feel equally powerless. They feel like the system puts its imperatives on them, and they don't have a choice but to build the smokestack, belching black smoke into the atmosphere, right? That's what they have to do. If they didn't do it, they'd be fired and somebody else would do it. If they didn't do it, another company would do it and all their employees would be out on the street. I think that the incentives create these imperatives, and in a lot of ways we are powerless in front of them, right? But all of us, almost all of us, not everybody certainly, but almost all of us actually get into it for the right reasons. Those incentives take over. So anyway, that's my long way of saying, I do think if you want to change the world, you have to sort of diagnose the incentives that are forcing everybody to behave a certain way, and then you change those incentives. And it's God's work if you can do it.
Which takes us full circle because we're back to business model. And, I think this is where there's a good full circle to go with. Always understand the business model because that's going to drive what actually goes on. And I think you're doing a remarkable job of trying to change that business model with a level of success, which is nice to see. And we'll be certainly cheering from the cheap seats. And we'll continue on our journey. And also, we're going to continue to look to find other people in other industries who have similar ideas about doing things the right way and trying to educate people. It's not honestly a great business model for us to come on and just educate people. I mean, we would make more money off of this if we were talking about crypto and the latest way to invest in crypto. That would be way more profitable for us. But a little bit of our soul would die every time we recorded a podcast, and I don't want my soul to be dying. So we chose to invest it this way.
I'm so glad you brought that up because it gives me the opportunity to talk about what I really came here to talk about, which is my new AI-driven crypto purchaser.
Yeah,
All the latest AI secrets.
You really need to call your business Fragment AI, and then you'll triple the valuation multiple on it overnight. So
$100 billion valuation.
Yeah. Speaking of your soul dying a little bit, yeah. The day you see us change our URL to fragment.ai, then you can schedule the funeral.
Well, that's a good spot to leave it on, Nick. Thanks so much for joining us. We are always here, as Colin said, trying to educate people and again, pull back the curtain, give them a little bit of insight to what's going on in their world, in their lives, in their finances. So I think you definitely furthered that today. So much appreciated.
Thank you guys very much for having me. It's been a ton of fun, and I look forward to the revolution in finance that you all are leading.
Coming soon to a street corner near you.
If your current financial advisor cannot explain how they and their firm are compensated, that's a problem. They really should be able to answer that question before you accept their advice. And if their answers leave you with more questions than confidence, it might be time to seek advice that aligns with your best interests. Contact us. No strings attached. You can find us at annoyingthecompetition.com.
For more information on the subject of today's podcast or any other financial topic, please visit us online at verecan.com. That's verecan.com. There's plenty of information there, or you can reach out to someone on the team. Thanks for listening.
Please note, the information provided in this podcast is for general information purposes only. It is not intended as financial, investment, legal, tax, accounting, or other professional advice. Our discussions are not a solicitation to buy or sell any securities or to make any specific investments. Any decisions, based on information contained in this podcast, are the sole responsibility of the listener. We strongly advise consulting with a professional financial advisor before making any financial decisions. Listeners should be aware that investing involves risks and that past performance is not indicative of future results. Barenaked Money is produced by Verecan Capital Management Inc., a licensed portfolio management company in Canada. We operate under the regulatory framework established by the provincial securities commissions in the provinces within which we operate. The views expressed in the podcast are our own and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of any regulatory authority. Remember, at Verecan Capital Management Inc., we focus on aligning our goals with yours, prioritizing integrity and transparency. For more information about us and our services, please visit our website. Thank you for listening, and let's continue to challenge the norms of the financial services industry together.